You think you know yourself. You think you're a good person. You believe that if someone in authority told you to hurt an innocent stranger, you'd refuse. You'd be the hero, the exception. But here's the disturbing truth that Stanley Milgram discovered in 1961. 65% of ordinary Americans delivered what they believed were lethal electric shocks to screaming strangers, simply because a man in a lab coat told them to continue. 65%. These weren't psychopaths. They weren't criminals. They were teachers, accountants, salespeople, people just like you. Ordinary people became killers, and the most terrifying part, every single one of them believed they would never do such a thing, just like you believe right now. Today, we're going to dissect the psychology of obedience, why your brain is wired to follow orders, how authority hijacks your moral compass, and what this reveals about the darkest chapters of human history. By the end of this video, you'll understand why you're far more dangerous than you think. The experiment. In 1961, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram designed an experiment that would shake the foundations of our understanding of human nature. The setup was simple. Participants were told they were taking part in a study about learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher and asked to administer electric shocks to a learner, a man strapped to a chair in another room, every time he answered a question incorrectly. The shock started at 15 volts, mild, uncomfortable, but with each wrong answer the voltage increased. 75 volts, 150 volts. The learner began to protest. At 300 volts he pounded on the wall, begging to be released. At 330 volts, complete silence. The learner stopped responding entirely. What the participants didn't know was that the learner was an actor. No real shocks were being delivered, but they believed it was real. They heard the screams. They felt the resistance of the switches. And yet, when the experimenter in the lab coat calmly said the experiment requires you to continue, 65% went all the way to 450 volts, a level clearly marked danger, severe shock. This wasn't Nazi Germany. This was New Haven, Connecticut. And that changes everything we thought we knew about obedience. Authority spell. Why did they do it? The answer lies in something called the agentic state, a psychological shift where individuals stop seeing themselves as responsible for their own actions and become mere instruments of authority. When you enter this state, something profound happens in your brain. Your sense of personal responsibility evaporates. You're no longer making decisions. You're following orders. The disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of submission to authority. Think about how you feel when your boss gives you an instruction you disagree with. That slight discomfort, quickly rationalized away because it's not your call. That's the agentic state in miniature. Milgram discovered that physical proximity to authority dramatically increased compliance. When the experimenter was in the room, obedience skyrocketed. When they gave instructions by phone, it dropped. Your brain evolved to respond to the physical presence of dominant individuals. Now that you understand this mechanism in yourself, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring the depths of your psyche with me, because what comes next reveals how this plays out in your everyday life. The uniform, the title, the confident tone, these are triggers that can override your moral compass without you even noticing. Gradual descent. Here's what makes Milgram's findings even more disturbing. The shocks didn't start at 450 volts. They started at 15. This is the foot-in-the-door technique operating at its most sinister level. Once you've pressed the switch at 15 volts, pressing it at 30 seems like a small step. You've already committed. You've already crossed the line. Small steps lead to horror. Each increment feels minimal, but the cumulative effect is catastrophic. This is precisely how ordinary people become participants in atrocities. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to commit evil. They make a series of small compromises. They look away once. They follow a questionable order. They tell themselves just this once. And before they know it, they are in so deep that turning back feels impossible. Evil rarely announces itself. It whispers incremental permissions. The Nazis didn't start with gas chambers. They started with discrimination, then isolation, then deportation. Each step normalized the next. And at every stage, ordinary people, people who loved their families, who went to church, who considered themselves moral, participated. Because they had already pressed the switch at 15 volts. The Nazi question. Milgram didn't design this experiment in a vacuum. He was haunted by a question that had tormented philosophers and psychologists since World War II. How could ordinary Germans participate in the Holocaust? The common explanation was that Germans were somehow different, more authoritarian, more obedient by nature. Milgram's experiment destroyed that comfortable illusion. Americans, citizens of the land of individual liberty and resistance to tyranny, proved just as capable of blind obedience as anyone else. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, coined the phrase "the banality of evil." Eichmann wasn't a monster. He was a bureaucrat, a paper pusher who organized train schedules. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were, and still are, terrifyingly normal. This is the hardest truth to accept. The guards at Auschwitz weren't aliens. They were humans, with the same brain architecture you have, the same capacity for love, for loyalty, for following orders. The only difference between you and them is circumstance, and that should terrify you. Modern obedience. You might think we've evolved past this, that modern education and awareness of history have inoculated us against blind obedience. You'd be wrong. In 2010, French television staged a fake game show called The Game of Death. Contestants were told to deliver increasingly powerful electric shocks to a fellow contestant who answered questions incorrectly. The screams were real. The suffering appeared genuine. 80% of participants went all the way to the maximum, believing they had seriously harmed or killed another human being. 80%, higher than Milgram's original findings. The only difference: instead of a scientist in a lab coat, the authority figure was a television host. Entertainment had replaced science, but the psychology remained identical. Look around your own life. How many times have you followed instructions you knew were wrong because your manager demanded it? How many times have you stayed silent when you witnessed injustice because speaking up would cost you? The agentic state doesn't require a laboratory. It's operating in your office, your school, your family right now. Your blind spots. Here's perhaps the most unsettling finding from Milgram's research. When he asked other psychologists and ordinary people to predict the results before the experiment, everyone predicted refusal. They estimated that only 1-3% of participants would go all the way to 450 volts. The actual number, 65%. We have a profound blind spot when it comes to our own capacity for obedience. We all believe we would be the hero, the one who stands up, the one who says no. But that's exactly what every participant believed before they started pressing the switches. Psychologists call this the fundamental attribution error, our tendency to explain others' behavior through their character while excusing our own through circumstances. When we see someone follow an immoral order, we think they are weak, cowardly, or evil. When we imagine ourselves in the same situation, we construct elaborate fantasies of resistance. This illusion of moral superiority is itself a danger. It prevents us from building the psychological safeguards we actually need. You cannot defend against a vulnerability you refuse to acknowledge. Mass psychosis. Milgram's participants were isolated. They faced authority alone in a calm laboratory setting. Now imagine what happens when you add fear, confusion, a perceived enemy, social validation from others who are also obeying. The percentage of obedient executioners explodes. Throughout history, mass psychosis has transformed peaceful neighbors into enthusiastic murderers. In Rwanda, Hutu civilians who had lived alongside Tutsi families for generations took up machetes and slaughtered them in weeks. Not because they were forced, because radio propaganda, social pressure, and fear created an environment where murder became normalized. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. This is the terrifying multiplier effect. In mass delusion, people don't just obey, they become zealots. They report their neighbors. They enforce rules more harshly than authorities demand. They compete to demonstrate their loyalty. Fear plus conformity equals atrocity. The 65% becomes 95, and the other 5%, they're marked as enemies, the resistors. But not everyone obeyed. 35% of Milgram's participants refused to continue at some point. What made them different? Milgram found several factors that reduced obedience. When the learner was in the same room, compliance dropped. When two other teachers refused to continue, the participant usually refused too. When the experimenter's authority was questioned or undermined, obedience plummeted. Resistance is contagious, but so is compliance. The resistors shared common traits: a strong sense of personal responsibility, exposure to diverse perspectives, and crucially, they had thought about these scenarios before they encountered them. 1. They claimed personal responsibility for outcomes. 2. They questioned legitimacy of authority. 3. They had moral frameworks prepared in advance. 4. They resisted social pressure from peers. This is why awareness matters. The participants who refused weren't morally superior by nature. They had psychological tools the others lacked. They had considered, what would I do if ordered to harm someone, before it happened. You can build these tools. You can rehearse resistance. But first, you have to abandon the fantasy that you don't need them. Building immunity. So how do you protect yourself from becoming a statistic in the next Milgram experiment, whether it takes place in a laboratory, an office, or a society descending into madness? First, accept your vulnerability. The moment you think I would never, you've lowered your defenses. Humility is your first defense. Second, define your absolute limits in advance. Decide now, in calm circumstances, what orders you will never follow. Write them down, because in the moment, your brain will rationalize anything. Third, cultivate relationships with people who think differently than you. The resistors in Milgram's experiment were influenced by seeing others resist. Surround yourself with people who question authority. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Fourth, practice saying no to small things. Obedience is a muscle, so is resistance. Every time you push back against a small injustice, you strengthen your capacity to resist larger ones. Fifth, remember that legitimacy is not the same as authority. A lab coat, a uniform, a title, these grant power but not moral permission. Question every command that conflicts with your values, regardless of its source. The mirror. Let's return to where we started. 65% of ordinary people, people who loved their families, considered themselves moral, believed they would never harm an innocent stranger, went all the way to what they believed was a lethal shock, because an authority figure told them to continue. And here's the final twist that Milgram discovered. When he asked participants afterwards why they continued, they didn't say I was following orders. They said I didn't want to ruin the experiment. They found ways to maintain their self-image as good people while participating in what they believed was torture. Your brain is doing this right now. It's constructing reasons why you would be different, why you would be the exception, why this doesn't apply to you. That defensive reaction is itself the vulnerability Milgram exposed. The question isn't whether you're capable of obedience to the point of atrocity. History and psychology have answered that question definitively. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you use it to build resistance, or will you file it away and return to the comfortable illusion that you're not like them? The choice, and for once it truly is a choice, is yours. Stanley Milgram spent his career trying to understand how ordinary humans become instruments of evil. What he discovered wasn't comforting. It wasn't about bad people or defective minds. If a system of death camps were set up in the United States, one would be able to find sufficient personnel for those camps in any medium-sized American town. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And realism is the foundation of protection. Now you understand the psychological machinery that can turn anyone, including you, into an obedient participant in horror. Knowledge is your only armor. You understand the agentic state, the gradual descent, the illusion of moral superiority, and you understand that the 65% didn't believe they would do it either. If you made it this far, comment 35% if you're committed to being among those who resist. The ones who remember their humanity when authority demands they forget it. The true test won't come in a laboratory. It will come in your life, in a moment when following orders feels easier than following your conscience. When that moment arrives, remember what you learned here. Remember that you're not immune, and choose to be in the 35%. Welcome to the Psyche Project. If this changed how you see yourself and the world, subscribe. Understanding human nature is how we transcend it.